Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, depending on what part of the world you're coming from. So good to have all of you here with us today to talk about synodality and walking together. My name is Joe Sinosak. I'm the publishing director for Novalis Publishing in Canada, and we are one of your hosts this afternoon. Before we get started with the formal presentation, I just have a couple little housekeeping details to take care of. First of all, you should know that we are being recorded, and the recording will be available to all of you afterwards, including all of those who have registered for this webinar and were, for one reason or another, are not with us today. Within a few days, we will send you an email with a link to the recording, so feel free to take another look at it afterwards. Secondly, many of you will have questions for our panelists, and we'd love to hear them, and we'll certainly tackle as many of them as we can. On your screen this afternoon, you will find at the bottom something called Q&A. If you press on that, you can type in your question, and we are monitoring it, and we'll take care of them. And finally, I'm sure many of you will want to know how you can get the book. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a screen showing exactly where you can go online to buy the book and a code you can use to get a 20% discount. So please take advantage of it. It's only for you who are participating in this webinar. So those are my announcements. And now I am going to hand the microphone over to Therese Ratliff. Therese, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. I'm Therese Ratliff, the publisher of Bayard Books and Devotionals in the United States, and today's event is brought to you by 3 members of Bayard's worldwide family, 23rd Publications in the US, Novalis Publishing in Canada, and La Croix International, based in France and serving a global English-speaking Catholic market. We'd like to welcome all of you who are participating in today's event. It's truly, as Joe said, an international gathering. More than 3,000 people are with us right now from around the world, which certainly indicates a great interest in the Pope's call to synodality. We're so glad to have you with us. And to begin, I'd like to introduce briefly our conversation partners for those of you who might not know them. Dr. Moira McQueen holds a law degree from the University of Glasgow and a doctorate in moral theology from St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, where she is currently on the graduate theology faculty. She has served as both executive director of the Canadian Catholic Bioethics Institute and as a member of the Vatican's International Theological Commission, and she was a representative at the Second Synod on Marriage and the Family in 2015. She is the author of the newly released work, Walking Together, a primer on the new synodality, which is a wonderful introduction to today's topic. We also have Dr. Massimo Fagioli, who is a full professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University. His books and articles have been published in more than 10 languages, and he is a much sought after guest on the international media circuit, speaking on topics relating to international politics, the global church, and church history. He's a regular columnist for Commonweal and La Croix International, and his recent book, Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States, has been translated into numerous languages around the world. And we're pleased to welcome Chris White, the Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter, who will guide our conversation. Before moving to Rome for his current post, Chris served as NCR's national correspondent, and his work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Washington Post, and Forbes magazine, among many other print and online publications. He's regularly appeared on TV and radio, including CNN, NPR, RTE, and the BBC. So thanks to all 3 of you for spending time with us today. And Chris, I'll hand the virtual mic over to you for what promises to be an engaging and informative discussion.
Thanks so much, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm not going to bore us with many introductory comments because I know everyone's eager to jump in on the conversation. But I want to frame the conversation by zeroing in on the tagline, embracing Pope Francis's new call to synodality. And if we focus on the word new, I think it's important to understand what's new. And in order to do that, I think we have to talk about what's old. So Maura, I'd like for you to start us off by giving us a crash course, if you will, on sort of the history of synodality, both sort of in the distant past and then the more recent past. So what's brought us up to this point?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, in terms of Catholic teaching, it's so important to bring in the old and the new, just to have a really solid basis theologically and spiritually. And so in terms of synodality, everybody looks back to the Council of Jerusalem in Acts, the book of Acts, where that really gives a primer, if you like, for how the church can organize itself. So in terms of the apostles meeting with, and it says in Acts, the elders of the church. So the apostolic succession part is, this is very condensed, of course, is in a sense taken care of, as well as the participation of lay people, so the non-apostolic aspect of the whole community. So the community was involved. And thereafter, synods, developing that name really later on, they took place several times in a different format. They weren't always just bishops, but others. So there were papal legates, that sort of type, who also invited to speak about important matters. And then really, I guess, after the Great Schism, if you like, and especially after the Reformation, the concept of synodality dropped out in the Catholic Church. In that sense. And then, of course, there was the huge First Vatican Council, which really, where all the bishops were represented, and the Second Vatican Council too. And at the Second Vatican Council, there was a real move, and this is internal by the bishops themselves, to have more representation in Rome, with the Pope and the Curia. And so Paul VI, if you like, retrieved the concept of synodality. It was always there, but had been rather lapsed, and so reinstituted synods. And they started right after his during and thereafter, after his papacy. So there have been several synods since then. And at the beginning, and even then, observers were, they started to ask observers, so people from other faith groups, other denominations. So the whole concept of synod started to broaden after Vatican II. And then not only were lay people invited as observers, that morphed, if you like, into actual participation. So where we are today is a synod is not like a whole council where every single bishop is, but in fact, representatives from every nationality, bishop representatives will attend the different synods, along with some lay representatives from their countries. So there really is it's still the Synod of Bishops would be its technical name, but it's in fact much broader than that already.
Thank you. And Massimo, to turn to you now, what happened in the sort of the years, the decades after the Second Vatican Council that really influenced Pope Francis to really decide to elevate synodality in his particular way in this papacy?
Yes, so these last 60 years have seen a great development in the consciousness of the Church on the ways in which Vatican II spoke and has been received. So here Vatican II, on the one side, had a very clear, explicit wish for bishops to be more involved in the central government of the Catholic Church. And on the other side, there was a less explicit, more implicit vision for a future governance of the church that is not limited to the episcopal collegiality, which means the bishops together with the Pope, but for synodality. So here, what we've seen after 1965, which is the year when Paul VI created this new body, the Bishop Synod, we have seen different ways in which the synods have unfolded, have been experienced, and have been received. So here, the synods of Paul VI were, I would say, the most exciting early stages of this new institution, because they were working still on the energy, on the wave of the Second Vatican Council, on these new issues, form of the presbyterate, justice in the world, all of this. And then there has been the long pontificate of John Paul II, where synods have been widely different between themselves. So there are synods that really have marked a high point in the reflection of the church, like, for example, the Synod of 1985 on the 20th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council, but other synods were used by the Vatican almost to rubber stamp papal teaching. And this is something that I'm not discovering anything. I mean, this is something that even Pope Francis has talked about, because as bishops, he has seen something like that. And so he comes to the papacy in 2013 with an experience which is unique compared to the previous bishops, because no other pope had gone through the sometimes frustrating experience of bishop synods of the 1980s, 1990s. And so immediately, 2014, 2015, the first two synods, very clearly Pope Francis wanted to revive that institution, first in terms of a different spirit. And so the ways in which he led the synod since 2014 has been different. What we see now, I believe, especially since 2018, is a second stage which moves towards some structural changes in the institution. And so different members that are added to this. And so here Francis is not inventing anything. I believe he's being faithful to the ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council that explicitly gave back to local bishops those powers that they had lost, as Moira said, after the 15th century. But also there is an ecclesiology of the people of God, that all Catholics are endowed with a special baptismal dignity. And so this is where we are now. So technically, we still have the same bishop synod that has not been changed drastically since the Constitution of 65, but clearly Francis has given signals that there has to be some kind of changes in the structure of the synod and in the way the bishop synod in Rome relates to local experiences of synodality, which in these last 50 years have been very rare, very isolated, and not connected in one big plan, which is where we are now, I think.
So you talk about the way it's changed the experience of participating in the synod. And, we've had two synods on the family under Pope Francis in 2014 and 15, the Synod on Young People in 2018, and the Amazon Synod in 2019. At each stage, there's been the involvement and the consultative stage with the laity. And I'd like to ask Moira to talk about the significance of that, specifically going back to 2014, just how new was that? How was it incorporated into the month-long synod deliberations? And, what sort of after effects have we felt or seen from that?
Yeah, I think this was one of the most important changes in terms of and why you can maybe call it new synodality, because synods aren't new, but the concept of synodality itself is evolving. And a major part in this evolution was that very first attempt to consult the lay people throughout the world by having questionnaires issued and asking people then to contribute directly to the Vatican so that there would be some kind of idea of lay people's concerns, or at least responses to the questionnaires, which were pretty stratified anyway, and fair enough, because you wouldn't want to be going all over the place with people's points and questions, not at the beginning, but just to give that opportunity for contribution. And so a central theme in any synod, and as Pope Francis mentions all the time, is participation. And the Synod office is underlining this by talking about participation of the whole church, going back to Lumen Gentium, going back to Vatican II, the common baptism that Massimo mentioned, that undergirds all this from a theological point of view and gives really lay people not so much the right to participate, but the capacity to participate by virtue of that common baptism. So in responding to those questionnaires, that was a really, I think, essential first step in ensuring that was direct participation. And so that has grown since then. And in this particular synod, I think people can see that maybe a lot more people know what synodality means. Certainly, I get the sense that many, many people really want to participate. So there's a kind of active sense of participation now. For a few years, or maybe rather over a few synods, this was all new. So most of us sort of thought questionnaires, what questionnaires? Why would my answers to a questionnaire ever be taken account of? You know, it was very hard to think globally. As I said, it is a bit of an evolution and it's a process, and many of us now have joined that process. So I really think this has made a really significant difference. And I noticed it myself at the synod I was involved in, and that active participation obviously has helped shape my ideas about synodality, that in terms of the contributions of lay people in the small groups at the synod, that those points then would be part of, and sometimes quite noticeably, any communications that would come out after. And in the document that the Pope actually wrote, it happened to be Amoris Laetitia in that particular case. But then I realized that now with the contribution of people before the synod, it's really going to the point where people are saying, this is for the participation that's needed. The synod office talks about getting to the people's questions, getting to the fact that now the synods might reflect the points that people want to raise in a sense from the bottom up. But it's really now looking at the whole people of God. I mean, there are many, many topics that could be talked about at synods. At the minute, just talking about the synod at Rome has to select a topic. So why not find out what are the boiling points for people? What are the points that they think need to be talked about as well? And I think that this idea of being able to contribute and put those points of view forward, that really involves, if they want, the whole laity. And so I would maybe call it revolutionary, because this is completely new in the whole history of our Catholic Church.
So it may be revolutionary, but with all new things, there are some growing pains. So I've got a question in two parts that I'm going to ask both of you to weigh in separately. When Pope Francis opened the synod in October, I was there at the Basilica, and one of the challenges of it was just the physical challenge of having lay representatives present from every continent because of COVID. So that was a physical challenge sort of outside of the church. So I'm curious, Massimo, what do you see as some external or extra ecclesial challenges to the new synod process? And then after Massimo finishes more, I'd love to hear from you about what you see as sort of the intra-ecclesial challenges to the new synod process.
So this is very, very interesting and is very important. So as a historian of the Second Vatican Council, it reminds me of some challenges that were typical of the convocation and of the celebration of the Second Vatican Council, which were the political situation of the 60s, I mean, the Cold War. The bishops from some countries could not attend and come to Rome. For now, for us today, it means that in some countries, synodality is seen as a luxury for the conditions in which local churches are are living, I mean, going through because of persecution in some countries, because of states that are in a political situation of, I mean, war or civil war. And then there are other challenges that come from the pressures coming from the outside that shape the life of local churches in a very particular way. For example, there are these communities of Catholics in the Arab states, Middle Eastern states, that have very limited freedom of religion, and there's something going on there. Okay, so I'm not saying that nothing's happening, but clearly there are different situations. To stay in the United States, it is very well known that the Catholic Church in the United States is very polarized, and one of the external factors is that in a highly polarized society, highly polarized political system, that makes it less likely for Catholics of different opinions, of different orientations theologically, to come together. And so this is not a theological challenge per se, but it is coming from the outside. I mean, COVID has slowed down everything. So this is a major rupture in the way we could travel and the way we communicate. I'll give you one example. I mean, with my students on Monday, we talked about the liturgical reform of the Second Vatican Council. And one question many had was, why cannot we celebrate Mass online via computer, which is something that it never crossed my mind when I was their age, but it was not something that until 2020 was so common to think about. I mean, synodality is also a liturgical experience, and the interruption we have suffered in our liturgies from COVID has impacted our sense of the necessity and of the possibility of gathering together, which is what synodality is. So this is a very particular moment, and it may sound the least propitious moment to organize a synodal process. I think this is exactly the right moment, because we must offer something that sounds so strange and so difficult, but I believe meets the expectations of so many people.
So thank you, Massimo, for that sort of external view. Moira, do you mind sort of taking the microscope and looking, internally and looking at what sort of challenges you see that are faced within?
Right. I think the very first one actually is administrative. I think it's extremely difficult to gather all this information, to synthesize it. I mean, dioceses are being asked to do this in 10 pages, which seems to me somewhat reductionist in terms of what might emerge, not insulting the diocesan capabilities, but just, 10 pages, come on. Anyway, that is administrative, but it is within the church itself. Perhaps more seriously, I think there is resistance from some bishops. I think, and it's been voiced in different places. And that's to be expected, because it is somewhat, no, the synods are not new, but lay participation definitely is, to the extent which it has grown. And I can understand why then there would be a feeling of trepidation, perhaps, that the laity is going to take over, getting too big for its boots, will be challenging everything right, left, and center. And no doubt some lay people will take that approach. But that's not what synodality is about. Synodality is first and foremost, and Pope Francis says this time after time, it's about listening. It's about listening and then participating, and then discernment, especially from the bishops. It's to be guided by the Spirit. So if we take on either clergy or laity, if we take off in a direction that's almost more political and challenging just for its own sake, I think that's a problem. And that is inside our church, both from our own laity and from some bishops. Other bishops are extremely enthusiastic. We only have to look at different websites, different synods all over the world that have already happened, national synods, for example, to see that there are many who are very, very keen on this. But there will be a kickback. I mean, as Massimo said, there's factionality, if that's a noun, in our church, in some countries more so than others. And I think that divide shows there as well. Also, from the laity point of view within the church, there are many lay people who don't like the whole idea of synodality, don't like the idea of lay participation to the extent to which synodality seems to be growing towards. Really, if you like, would prefer a pre-Vatican II church where, there was a much more distinct marker between clergy and laity. And I think that just defeats the purpose, if you like, of developing the Second Vatican Council itself and Lumen Gentium's whole emphasis on the church as the whole people of God, which was a tremendous and internal theological breakthrough. And it, in a sense, really sort of made the rest of us aware that the church had changed, intended to change, is going to change. And I really think participation of the laity in its best form really is a product of what the Second Vatican Council itself was trying to achieve. So, yeah, anyway, there are challenges for sure, but I think there's also an awful lot of opportunities.
Okay, so let's talk about those opportunities then. I'd love to hear from both of you, and since you're right here, Moira, let's start with you. What are you seeing specifically in the US and Canada as best practices so far?
So far, I think some of the dioceses that have really taken this on as a real challenge have tried to incorporate as many people as possible. And Massimo's point about COVID right now, of course, has restricted even the practices, unfortunately, to an extent, but virtually an awful lot has been achieved. Some of the websites, some of the explanatory material, and some of the websites, and of course, I haven't looked at every diocese in North America, but I've looked at several because I'm interested just to see what the reaction is. And that's where I get the sort of more encouraging feeling from. There is a real impetus from many of the websites, therefore representing the bishops, to urging people to fill in these questionnaires, urging people to read some more about this whole process, trying to get people to see that it's not just about the questionnaire, that's just the beginning. That synodality is not just about the event of this particular synod coming up, but it really is more about lay people participating, and questionnaire is one of the first steps to do it. Many parishes, many dioceses already have working groups where people are meeting to talk about this. Many people have realized that you don't just gather and answer, 3 or 5 or 10 questions. Many groups, and I know this because some people have been asking me questions about this, they meet to discuss these matters first, and then they're going to write their answers to the questionnaires. I think that's what it could be about. And I think that particular aspect, the discussion part, so that people, first of all, understand what synodality is about, if it still is a little bit new, and it is. And then they get the sense of participating together first to talk about these things. And then they participate further by sending the questionnaires. So the multi-layered approach, I think, is already possible. And they could also look at something like perhaps the synod that was held in Australia, where they really lay out very carefully the processes and helps, hindrances, best practices, all those kinds of things. And now we can see we have the benefit of that sort of post factum has already happened. So I think there's many ways that some of us who are only just beginning, there are all these parts we can look back to for help in sort of helping us seize the opportunity.
Thank you. And Massimo?
So I believe the situation is very diverse. So there's, anecdotally, I've heard of very good experiences that have started. In other places, there is frustration of lay Catholics because they haven't heard much or anything from their local bishop or their parish priest. So, as always, the Catholic Church is like a big sea carrier. I mean, it is very hard to start the engines and start moving and change direction. So here in the United States, there is, I believe, one particular problem, which is not as serious in other countries, is that there is a reluctance among many bishops or some bishops and some members of the clergy against the very concept of synodality. Why? Because it sounds and it smells Vatican II. And one problem is that in some dioceses, in some local churches, there has been really either an interruption in the tradition on the Second Vatican Council or an outright rejection against Vatican II in some places. If you don't know Vatican II, or if you have been trained, or if you grew up in a Catholic environment where Vatican II has been an object of bashing or blaming for everything, it is very hard that you will understand what synodality is about. And so this is, I believe, integral part of Pope Francis' project, because the synodality process, I don't think it is an accident that a certain acceleration of Pope Francis on the liturgical reform happens at the same time. Okay, so this is something that I've seen in this country, and there is an institutional logistical challenge, but synodality needs to rediscover the theological sources of Vatican II, which is on the one side being able to, renew and going beyond the institutional structure of the church, but at the same time being able to trust the church that is offering us this. And this is a time of a crisis of trust in general, even for the church and for institutions. And so this is where we are, and this is why there's so much to do. But I've been encouraged by what I have seen, what I've heard. The very fact that attending this webinar, there are online right now almost 2,000 people. It is surprising in a good way. So that's not to be taken for granted.
We've got a ton of questions pouring in, which is great. So before I turn over to the audience questions, I want to sort of put a statement to both of you that I've heard, used a lot over the last few months. And I want to hear your thoughts. Agree or disagree, true or false. Synodality will be Pope Francis's greatest legacy. Moira, let's start with you.
Okay, perhaps that's true. You can see I'm qualifying it already. But if we take synodality in its widest sense, so then going back to retrieving Vatican II theology and really building on that, because everybody agrees it has not been completely developed. So in fact, if synodality itself is an offshoot really from that, morphs again, then that would be synodality and the practice of it, I think would be an amazing achievement. But to be retrieving the whole theology of Vatican II for the whole church in every aspect, would be a magnificent legacy too. And I do think, to use one of his words, these are all interconnected. So when one part is raised, whether it's liturgical reform, curial reform, canon law reform, process reform as in synodality, participation, encouragement of the laity, a different view of the laity, sort of hierarchical so-called divide, and all of that in a process. I shouldn't use the word process because I'm actually thinking in a spiritual dimension here. The truest form of the Catholic Church, to me, I mean, really has to be guided by the Spirit. Obviously, that's the whole sort of backbone to that the ship is being steered in the best path. And I think the interconnectedness, again, of this particular Pope's looking to all these dimensions, which includes synodality, I think all of that comes together. So I could in one way say synodality will be the most important, but I think I'm more inclined to say, along with all those other dimensions, they all kind of rank in the same way, because the intent is to move the Catholic Church in the way the Spirit intends it to move.
And Massimo?
I believe that is true. A few things must happen, though. I mean, there must be something like an institutional effort to cement what Pope Francis has talked about. So there must be not just an opening of the door to an idea of change in the church and of reform that for a few years before Francis had become anathema, really. So there must be some institutional changes, legal and bureaucratic or organizational, that must follow. And I believe they will follow. So because as it happened for John the 23rd when he called Vatican II in 59, I'm not sure he had an idea of what was going to happen. But this is how leadership works. I mean, you know that there's something that it is necessary to do, and then the consequences will be dealt with by your successor or something. So I believe we are in that kind of moment. It's very hard to imagine anyone putting the genie back into the bottle. I don't see that happening easily, or at exorbitant costs for the self-understanding of the Catholic Church, which is not a monarchy, it is not an aristocracy, it's not a corporation. And so this is why I believe this is the biggest legacy of Pope Francis.
Okay, so let's jump over to the audience questions, and we've got a great number of them, but one that has come through many times already, and before we even started today: what do I do if my diocese isn't doing anything or my bishop isn't talking about synodality? So Moira, I'll put that to you.
Yeah, first of all, it's a very sad situation, but it's realistic in terms of what we've all been saying about opportunity and resistance. So yeah, it's something that has to be dealt with. I've spoken to a few people about this who've encountered that problem, and it's pretty clear on the Synod office at the Vatican that people can respond directly to them. I mean, first of all, most people will try their diocese, and if the diocese is tone deaf, then don't waste time anymore. But go ahead and deal with, form your own group, have a discussion group, or do it yourself. I mean, you can just do it, frankly, by yourself too. But most people would like to discuss, because that's the participation part, and I think that's very important. And then could send those the results directly to the Synod office at the Vatican. There is a number, there is a mailing, there is a website, all those sorts of things. Because I think the office from the very beginning pointed out that this could, of course, happen. Nobody's expecting 100% participation in anything, so we wouldn't really be any different. So it's not as if one is bypassing a diocese, say, and sort of going straight to the top. But if a diocese doesn't respond, I think it's only right that people have that their opportunity viewed and their contribution made as well. So I think there's a very practical way to handle that. Yeah.
Yes, in the Synod office here in Rome, I think there's some of the most overworked people I know. They're getting lots of inquiries, both from people who are eager to participate, and I know they're eager to receive them. So one question that is interesting, if you go back to the introductory documents put out last fall before the Synod, there's an invitation for participation, not just for Catholics, but all believers. To everyone, and a question that comes through here is, effectively, how this is something that's very important for the life of the church. How are non-believers able to participate in that process? Sort of, what good effectively can come from their contribution? I'll let you start, Moira, since.
Okay, no, I wish I had a really good answer for that. Obviously, I mean, the most obvious one is one does it oneself. If one knows within one's family or people who have a list of complaints but would like them heard, it's very often complaints, by the way, and not always positive suggestions, but sometimes they are. But that getting out to people is very much a really difficult task. My husband had just told me about an article he read, I think, in our Catholic Register, about a bishop who started coffee mornings and just opened up discussions in different groups and invited people to come. I guess even that would have to go out, through the web, and then expecting people to invite people. I've heard of people, and I think that's a really good idea. I mean, it's very straightforward, and it does mean, somebody has to make that first move, but it's possible. And then I've heard of many people who have just sort of picked up the challenge and had their own family sessions and then recorded what their family said. And I don't know if they're going to return that to their diocese or send it to Rome, but there are ways of doing it. And I'm sure there's some pretty creative people listening right now who can send in their suggestions for what they've already done.
Massimo, a number of people have asked about the German synodal way, which of course has been taking place for some time now in Germany. And you have a number of lay delegates and bishops, and they're voting up or down on certain proposals. Pope Francis has been very clear, repeating over and over that the Synod is not a parliamentary process. So I'm going to try to sum up some of these questions all together here. Is the German synodal way heading off the tracks? One person wants to know. Is Rome going in a different direction? Is the criticism targeted at the German synodal way bad for the new synodality? So I'll let you tackle that beast however you want to.
So first of all, I'm not sure that the image of tracks for the synodal process is entirely accurate, because the whole process builds its tracks. So you find your path by walking. So it is true that the Synod in Rome has prepared guidelines, but there has been also, there is room for local implementations of the synodal cultures. Now, the synodal path in Germany, it's something that actually starts before Francis starts talking about this, and it goes back to a fundamental experience of the Catholic Church in Germany after Vatican II, which was the Synod of Würzburg, but it was a national synod of 1971-1975, a fundamental moment in the life. So here, what is typical of the German synod is that it is highly structured, very representative of different kinds of members, bishops and theologians and lay people and women and religious, it is highly structured because this is how German Catholicism works generally. So here it's clear that there is a discrepancy between the ways in which Pope Francis has talked about synodality and the ways in which the assemblies of the German Synod, 5 total, and the third one was just completed 2 weeks ago, is unfolding. On the other hand, if you look at what the German Synod has approved and voted in terms of proposals, they are nothing more and nothing less than what you can see, for example, in the recommendations following the nationwide investigations of sexual abuse. Ministry, women, accountability, it's always the same stuff. What hurts some people is that in Germany, there is actually a consensus on these things, and even a consensus among the vast majority of bishops. This is what is different about Germany. They are just more clear, more organized. They make, in my opinion, a much better theological argument, much more solid. So here, I think that there will be at some point a reckoning between the Roman ways and the German path. Honestly, I cannot imagine a future for the Catholic Church in Germany without accepting some or most of those proposals. Honestly, because those were already part of a consensus 50 years ago. And for 50 years, they have been told, be patient, be patient, be patient. After 50 years, so I believe that it's a Catholic synod. It is orthodox and bold on some of the proposals. I'm curious to see how Rome deals with this. It will not be easily ignored as some of the proposals that came from the Amazon Synod, for example. So this is clearly a very delicate point, but I don't share at all the opinion of those who see the German Synod fundamentally diverting or going its own way. I don't agree with that. It's a contribution that other churches simply cannot make because they are not as organized, as rich, as highly structured as in Germany.
Moira, a Canada-specific question here that I think we'd all be keen to hear from you and learn from. The situation with the residential schools in Canada is obviously a very sore and painful part. How do you see the Synod participatory process serving as a way of reckoning with that past? What have you seen? What do you hope to see?
Actually, I've often thought in terms of, national synods, so this is just my own thinking, that of course would be the most topical, perhaps, challenge for Canada to deal with. I'm talking now within terms of the Catholic Church, but that would also provide wonderful opportunities for other faith, denominations rather, who also had residential schools. So in terms of having people participate, so from all over, so from Indigenous people themselves, from the victim's point of view, from the bishop's point of view, all that kind of thing, that's because many people, including the Indigenous people, are really moving towards the healing process. That is not at all to ignore the abuse and some new claims that have to be dealt with, but all these things always go on at the same time. But there are interesting moves that I believe towards that healing process, for example, and I think if Pope Francis does come, then that is part of that process. So I think a synodal way of handling that particular topic, where as many people as possible could participate one way or the other. I mean, and this, I'm saying this isn't about to happen. I'm just saying this is what I think would be a wonderful topic for a synod, because it is so topical, so relevant, so all-encompassing, really, for the people of Canada, all peoples in Canada. So, as Massimo said, in different countries, and Germany is really dealing with the hot button issues that bother nearly every country: women's ordination, sexuality issues, and all those sorts of things, and abuse, of course. And in Canada, I think we have maybe the abuse one in spades at the minute because of the recent revelations. So I don't see it in terms of it's being a global synod, when Pope Francis we're still really talking about process and evolution and how you make your contribution and participation, absolutely vital for the whole synodality aspect to develop. But in terms of national synods or local synods, as in Germany, for example, I do think this is something that could be done. We haven't had, as far as I'm aware, historically, somebody can correct me from Canada, I don't think there's been a national synod, but a few dioceses in the past have had diocesan synods so they've dealt with some issues, but I don't think anything nearly as serious as this. So I think it's providential, myself, that the concept of synodality is developing, and although there is resistance in some places, it's being met willingly in other places in the hierarchy itself. And I really think this is an area that would maybe make sure that those of us maybe in the Catholic Church in Canada who were not directly responsible or involved or even knew about these things, but it would raise awareness. It would help us to relate to the people who have been victimized. It would give those people an increasing voice, which they're only gradually beginning to have. At the same time, laity in Canada and elsewhere haven't had a particularly prominent voice. So I would see that synodality, the synodal process, as being something that is, spiritually, materially, socially beneficial overall. So I'm hoping for that. Right now, in terms of practice, most dioceses are just at the same stage as everywhere else in terms of getting their contributions organized and doing a pretty good job of it. And we haven't had anything along the lines that Massimo has been discussing. The German synodal Weg is way ahead of, I think, just about every other national synodal journey so far. So we have a lot of I wouldn't say catching up to do. We have catching up to do in our own way, and I do think it might be very varied from country to country in terms of what that process will bring up from the ground up to be discussed at a national level, which may then become something for the global church. I don't know. We'll see. Yeah.
Massimo, you hinted at this earlier, but we've gotten some questions about the Pope's restrictions of the traditional Latin Mass, which of course has dominated the headlines for about 6 months now. And a constant complaint is, if the synod process is about listening and dialogue, there is a contingent of voices, probably a small but vocal minority of voices that really do want the Latin Mass back, and they don't understand this, and they see this as counterproductive and perhaps anti-synodal. What's your response to that?
So this is a tricky one. So the enthusiasm for the preconciliar Latin Mass is a problem that in North America has extremely particular features that you don't find in other countries because of the English, because of a mainly Protestant country until a few years ago, and so on. So I believe that there is a difference between what Francis has said on the issue, saying we cannot tolerate these campaigns against Vatican II. That is a very solid argument. I believe it is different, the ways in which the decisions to restrict celebration of Latin Mass can be carried out. So I believe that this is still unfolding. We don't know what will be the success of that decision coming from Rome. I believe there will be a learning process out of this on both sides, in Rome, in the United States, and so on. I have seen this enthusiasm for the Latin Mass in some of my undergraduate students, and I'm learning myself. So here, synodality should be, and could be, a moment to make one step back from the controversy and recreate a space for a truce of these liturgical wars. Because being synodality also a spiritual experience and also has a liturgical dimension, in a church that is liturgically fractured, synodality is not going to work. So there has to be, in the minds of local bishops and local pastors, one way to suspend that war on the Latin Mass. And this is very complicated because, I mean, I have that luxury because I have students in my classroom twice a week for 4 months. And so I can establish a connection that it's a luxury for most pastors. This is really a painful moment, and it must be addressed, I think.
I think we're having to wind down our discussion here. We've had well over 100 questions come in just during the course of this. But I'm going to give you the final word, Moira, before we turn it back over to our organizers. In your experience, what would you see the role of theologians in participating in this process?
I always think theologians have a lot to say, a lot to contribute. That is the main point. The whole point of studying theology, after all, is to come to grips with some of these questions, to analyze them, to help develop them, not just to treat them as ivory tower discussions, although that part's necessary, the sheer academic background, the history, the scriptural, traditional foundations, all those sorts of things. And you need to be fairly well trained to be able to do that properly. But the church has always had this sort of doctrinal and pastoral aspects side by side. So, being on the International Theological Commission, I think we felt very strongly that although it's a doctrinal document coming through the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the one in Synodality, but the idea was to, make this a question of awareness, a question of urgency, in a sense, just to disseminate this knowledge because even it's true. I mean, many people said to me, what on earth is synodality? So I think that the task of theologians is to help everybody, including the hierarchy, who maybe haven't had a chance to look at these questions or in any depth, to come to terms with, as Massimo says, the history of it, and looking at the Vatican II contributions, as well as the different papal decisions since Vatican II, and to see also some kind of projection into the future and the shaping of the church.
Great. Thank you both. And of course, Therese, as a theologian, Moira, as a theologian, has written a whole book on this. So back to you, Therese.
Well, many thanks to all three of you, our conversation partners, for really introducing us to this topic in such a clear and wide-ranging way, and for prompting so many questions. As Chris said, we just had a really active question and answer session, and it was impossible to get to them all in the hour that we had, but it's an indication that the Spirit is really moving us to participate more fully and more joyfully in the body of Christ, which is a really great thing. A quick reminder that Dr. McQueen's book, Walking Together, is available with that special discount from the website that will be on your screen momentarily. And to everyone who participated today, please keep an eye on your inbox for a video link to this presentation. If you have people that you know that weren't able to participate live, they will also get this link. And thanks again for joining us. And we hope to spend time with you again at a future event.